Most guys realize their marriage is over when divorce papers land in their hands. That wasn't how it happened for me. I discovered everything in my own basement, and before I could even make sense of what was unfolding, my name had somehow ended up tied to things I'd never seen or touched. My name is Lewis Jackson, and I'm 51 years old. I live in a modest 3-bedroom home in Columbus, Ohio. Every Saturday morning I coach a local youth soccer team, and up until 11 days ago, I honestly believed life had treated me pretty well. Looking back now, that version of my life feels like it belonged to somebody else. I'll get to everything that happened, but first I should tell you a little about my wife. Her name is Claire Ann Jackson. We were together for 18 years and married for 15 of them. She loved lavender-scented candles, spent hours listening to true crime podcasts, which, if I'm being honest, probably should have raised a few questions, and she never drank coffee without exactly 1 spoonful of sugar and a splash of oat milk. I would have sworn I knew that woman better than anyone else on earth. At least that's what I believed. Everything started on an ordinary Tuesday in February. Personally, I've always thought February is the most miserable month of the year, so maybe I should have taken it as a warning. Claire was in Atlanta visiting her old college roommate, Donna. She'd already been gone for 3 days, and I wasn't exactly suffering. I was enjoying the temporary bachelor lifestyle, eating cereal for dinner, flipping between sports on every TV in the house, and wearing the same hoodie for 2 straight days without feeling guilty about it. Honestly, I was having a pretty good time. Then the furnace started making noise. It wasn't the normal creaking and clicking that every furnace makes when it's freezing outside. This sound was different. It was low, steady, and metallic, almost like one piece of metal was slowly grinding against another in a way it definitely wasn't supposed to. I searched Google, called the first HVAC company that popped up, and about 40 minutes later a technician showed up at my door. His name was Dale Briggs from Briggs & Sons Heating and Cooling. Nice enough guy. Big mustache, smelled faintly like coffee mixed with motor oil, and looked like he'd fixed furnaces his entire life. "Give me about 20 minutes, he said before heading downstairs to the basement. "No problem," I answered. While he worked, I made myself a sandwich, turned on a sports highlight show, and settled onto the couch. I hadn't even finished half the sandwich before my phone buzzed. The message was from Dale. "Mr. Jackson, there's a locked door behind your storage shelves. Who's inside?" I actually laughed. I texted back, "Dale, I think you've got the wrong house. There isn't any locked door down there." A few seconds later, 3 little typing dots appeared. Then another message came through. "Sir, I can hear someone breathing behind it. There are 4 padlocks on the outside of the door." The sandwich stopped halfway to my mouth. 4 padlocks. At that moment I didn't really understand why those words bothered me so much. Later, though, I couldn't stop thinking about them. Locks on the outside of a door aren't meant to keep strangers from getting in. They're meant to keep whoever's already inside from getting out. That isn't security. That's a cage. I don't remember making the decision to run. 1 second I was standing in my kitchen, and the next I was flying down the basement stairs as fast as my legs would carry me. Dale was standing in front of the old metal storage shelves Claire had insisted on keeping for years. I'd suggested donating them more than once, but she'd always refused. Now the shelves had been pulled a few inches away from the wall. Behind them was something I'd never seen before. A plain gray door. In 15 years of living in that house, I had absolutely no idea it even existed. #### Part 2. The door looked completely ordinary. It was one of those cheap hollow core doors, painted the exact same gray as the basement walls. With those old storage shelves pushed against it, you'd never suspect it was there. Not once in 15 years had I thought to move them far enough to discover what was hiding behind them. What made it even stranger were the locks. There weren't 1 or 2. There were 4 heavy-duty padlocks, each fastened to its own metal latch. And from the other side of that door came the unmistakable sound of slow, steady breathing. I looked at Dale. "Call the police," I said. He gave a quick nod. "Already doing it." Less than 10 minutes later, 3 officers were standing in my basement. Meanwhile, I felt like I'd somehow wandered into someone else's nightmare. It was my house, but none of it felt familiar anymore. Using bolt cutters, the officers snapped each padlock off one by one. While they worked, I kept sending Claire text messages. "Call me when you get a chance. Something really strange is happening." No reply. I told myself she was probably having dinner with Donna or had her phone buried in her purse. I needed some explanation that made sense because nothing happening inside my own basement did. Finally, the last lock dropped to the floor. One of the officers slowly pulled the door open. The room was empty. Not just empty, it looked almost staged. The concrete floor had been swept spotless. There wasn't a single piece of trash, a footprint, or even a layer of dust. A lone light bulb hung from the ceiling, but it wasn't switched on. The only thing inside the room was a small Bluetooth speaker sitting quietly in one corner. One officer walked over and touched it. "It's still warm," he said. Next to the speaker sat a cheap prepaid cell phone with a cracked screen, resting on top of an old cardboard box. The breathing. It hadn't been real. It was just an audio recording playing on a loop. A younger officer named Tate carefully picked up the burner phone while wearing gloves. He turned it over in his hands before looking at us. "Someone activated this recently," he said. "I'd guess sometime within the last hour." I stared at him. "So whoever did this new Dale was already down here?" He nodded. "Looks that way." That was the moment everything inside my head shifted. Someone had known exactly when the repairman reached the basement. They'd waited until he was standing near those shelves before triggering the recording. The fake breathing wasn't random. It had one purpose, to make Dale believe someone was trapped behind that door. That would make him text me. I'd rush downstairs. I'd call the police. The officers would find the hidden room. Every single step happened exactly the way someone intended. This wasn't some prank pulled by bored teenagers. It was planned. Every move had been carefully arranged long before I ever picked up the phone to call the HVAC company. Someone had written the script. The rest of us were just following it without realizing it. 2 days later, the next piece of the puzzle showed up. That's also when I stopped feeling like the homeowner and started feeling like the prime suspect. It happened so quietly I barely noticed. 1 minute Officer Tate was asking routine questions about my house and whether I'd ever seen the hidden room before. The next minute Detective Roy Callahan was sitting across from me at my own kitchen table with a yellow legal pad in front of him. He looked up at me. "Mr. Jackson, have you ever rented a storage unit on Mercer Road?" I shook my head. No. According to him, I had. Twice. Both rentals had supposedly been paid in cash. Even worse, every document carried my name. When investigators opened Unit 114, they found women's clothing neatly packed inside. There was also a prepaid debit card connected to an account that had somehow been opened under my name. Then they showed me a photograph. A woman I'd never seen before smiled back at the camera. She looked like she was somewhere in her 30s, with dark hair and the kind of relaxed smile people wear when they have no idea their picture will someday become evidence in a criminal investigation. Detective Callahan watched my face carefully before speaking. "Her name is Angela Pruitt." He paused. "She was reported missing 11 days ago." Then he looked directly into my eyes. "Do you know her?" I answered without hesitation. "No." Because it was the truth. I've never seen that woman before in my life. ####Part 3. That answer wasn't a lie. I'd never met Angela Pruitt. I'd never spoken to her, never crossed paths with her, and until Detective Callahan slid that photograph across the table, I didn't even know she existed. But there was one thing I kept to myself that night. Not because I was trying to hide it. Because I needed time to understand what it meant. As soon as the detective left, I walked straight upstairs to our bedroom. I didn't stop in the hallway or turn on the television. Something in the back of my mind was pulling me toward Claire's side of the room. Above her nightstand was a shelf filled with books she'd read over the years. Some she'd finished once and forgotten about, while others she'd come back to over and over again. One of those books was her worn-out copy of In Cold Blood. I'd seen her reading it countless times. Slow Sunday mornings, coffee in her hand, sunlight pouring through the window, that book was almost always nearby. I pulled it off the shelf. Then another. Then another. When I opened In Cold Blood, something slipped from the back cover. A small square photograph landed in my hand. It was Angela. The exact same picture Detective Callahan had shown me only hours earlier. I just sat down on the edge of the bed. For 15 years, Claire and I had shared that room. We'd celebrated birthdays there, argued, laughed, watched movies, talked about retirement, and planned vacations. Now I was sitting on the mattress holding a photograph of a missing woman that my own wife had hidden inside one of her favorite books. She hadn't buried it in the attic. She hadn't locked it inside a safe. She'd tucked it inside a novel she kept within arm's reach. Almost like she wanted to know it was always close. I couldn't stop thinking about all the ordinary moments we'd shared. Every family dinner. Every vacation. Every lazy Sunday morning when I'd watched Claire sip her coffee, one sugar, just a splash of oat milk, and quietly read that very book without the slightest hint that anything was wrong. How long had that picture been there? Weeks? Months? Years? And an even worse question hit me. How long had she been putting this entire plan together? Until then, I honestly believed the worst thing that could happen to a man my age was losing his health, his career, or maybe even his peace of mind. I was wrong. The worst feeling imaginable is realizing the person you've trusted for nearly 2 decades was never the person you believed she was. It wasn't just betrayal. It felt like someone had quietly erased 18 years of my life and replaced every memory with a question mark. Then another thought crossed my mind. Everyone kept talking about the evidence against me. The hidden room. The storage unit. The missing woman. But none of that hurt as much as one simple realization. Claire hadn't made one careless mistake. She wasn't confused. She wasn't having some kind of breakdown. And this wasn't the result of one bad decision. Everything she'd done had been deliberate. Every smile. Every conversation. Every reassuring word. She'd been working towards something the entire time. 6 days had passed since Dale sent me that text from my basement. 6 days since the police had cut open those padlocks. 6 days since Detective Roy Callahan entered my life. He never really left after that. Sometimes he'd knock on my door with another question. Other times he'd simply park his unmarked Crown Victoria a few houses away like he was waiting for something. Maybe he thought I wouldn't notice. I noticed. I'm 51 years old. I'm not blind. Claire had come home from Atlanta 2 days after everything started. Over the phone, I'd only told her that something strange had happened and that I needed her back as soon as possible. The second she walked through the front door, she looked exactly like any loving wife would. Her eyes filled with concern. She wrapped both arms around me. Then she held my face in her hands. "Louis, what happened? Are you okay? God help me." For almost 45 minutes. I believed every single word she said. Part 4. She cried when I showed her the hidden room in the basement. The tears looked real. Maybe they actually were. At this point, I honestly couldn't tell whether there was any difference between genuine emotion and a performance she'd perfected over the years. She stayed close to me while I explained everything: the 4 padlocks, the Bluetooth speaker, the burner phone, even the recording that had fooled all of us into believing someone was trapped behind that door. She reacted exactly the way anyone would expect. This is terrifying. Who would do something like this? Then she asked one question that didn't stand out at the time. Do you think we should hire a lawyer? Back then, I thought she was trying to protect me. Now I realize she wasn't being supportive. She was being strategic. She wasn't thinking about my safety. She was thinking several moves ahead. 4 days later, Detective Callahan came back to the house. This time, Claire was sitting beside me when he told us about Storage Unit 114 on Mercer Road. I watched her carefully while he talked. Most people would have missed it completely. For less than a second, she froze. It was almost like watching a computer lock up before the screen refreshes. Then, just as quickly as it happened, she recovered. The worried expression came back. The tears followed right behind it. She reached across the table and grabbed my hand. Someone is framing Lewis, she said with complete confidence. This is obviously a setup. My husband has never rented a storage unit. Callahan looked at her for a long moment. Then he asked a question that caught me off guard. Mrs. Jackson, what makes you so certain it's obvious? She answered without even stopping to think. Because I know my husband. At the time, those words comforted me. Later, I couldn't stop replaying them in my head. Over and over. Probably 400 times. The more I thought about her answer, the stranger it sounded. She didn't say I was innocent. She didn't say I'd never do something like that. She didn't even say it was impossible. Instead, she chose her words with incredible care. She simply said she knew me. It sounded loving. But underneath, it was precise. Almost like something an experienced attorney would say instead of a wife trying to defend her husband. That conversation stayed with me. The more I analyzed it, the more convinced I became that every sentence Claire spoke had a purpose. Nothing was accidental. Nothing ever had been. By the 7th day, I decided I needed someone I could trust completely. So I called my friend Gary Howell. Gary and I had known each other since college. That kind of friendship earns you the right to tell each other uncomfortable truths without worrying about hurt feelings. He also happened to work in insurance fraud investigations. His entire career revolved around uncovering lies that were carefully built to look like the truth. If anyone could spot something I was missing, it was Gary. I told him everything. The basement. The hidden room. The storage unit. Angela Pruitt. The photograph inside Claire's book. He stayed quiet for a long time after I finished. Finally, he asked a question I wasn't expecting. Lewis, how many bank accounts do you and Claire share? I counted them in my head. 3, I answered. Checking, savings, and our household credit account. Gary nodded. Who manages them? I opened my mouth. Then I stopped. The answer seemed embarrassingly obvious. Claire did. She'd been handling our finances since the 2nd year of our marriage. I remembered mentioning one evening that I hated dealing with budgets and bills. She'd smiled and said she'd take care of all of it. It seemed like a gift. And honestly, she'd done a great job, or at least that's what I'd always believed. The bills were always paid on time. Our savings account kept growing. Nothing ever looked unusual. So why would I question it? Gary leaned back in his chair. I want you to pull every bank statement you can find. How far back? 5 years minimum. I ended up going back 7. ###Part 5. 7 years of statements covered my dining room table before I was done. At first glance, everything looked completely normal. Nothing jumped out at me. There weren't any huge withdrawals, no suspicious wire transfers, and no mysterious overseas accounts. If someone had glanced through those records for a few minutes, they would have assumed our finances were in great shape. That's what made it so brilliant. Claire hadn't stolen money in a way that would attract attention. She'd moved it patiently. $100 disappeared here. A small transfer there. A subscription to a company I'd never heard of quietly renewed every month. Every few months, there'd be a cash withdrawal, always just small enough to avoid triggering any reporting requirements. None of those transactions looked important by themselves. But together, they told a very different story. Over the course of 7 years, just over $60,000 had quietly vanished from our accounts. 60,000. And I'd never noticed. I sat there at 2 o'clock in the morning staring at those statements, and the feeling that settled over me wasn't panic. It wasn't even anger. It was something colder. Much colder. Fear comes fast. This was different. This was the realization of just how long someone had been building something right in front of me while I never saw it happening. Then I noticed the date of the very first irregular transaction. 14 months after our wedding. I read it again because I honestly thought I'd made a mistake. 14 months. Back then, we were still unpacking boxes in our first apartment together. We were talking about vacations, decorating rooms, and trying to decide where we'd eventually buy our first house. While I was dreaming about our future, Claire had already started creating another one. The next morning Gary came over. Without saying much, we spread everything across the dining room table. Bank statements. The paperwork for Storage Unit 114. Police reports. Phone records. And the timeline I'd stayed up until 3 in the morning putting together on a yellow legal pad. Gary studied every page without speaking. I'd known him long enough to recognize what that silence meant. Whenever Gary stopped talking, it was because the truth was worse than he wanted to say out loud. Finally, he tapped the storage unit paperwork. "Walk me through that week," he said. "What do you mean?" "Your phone." I frowned. "What about it? Where was it the night before someone rented that storage unit in your name?" I answered automatically. "On my nightstand. I leave it charging there every night." Gary nodded once. "And where was Claire?" I stared at him. Then the answer hit me. She was in bed with me. Neither of us said anything for several seconds. For 15 years, we'd shared the same bedroom. The same bed. Every single night. I had never once considered that leaving my phone on the nightstand while I slept might be a vulnerability. But to Claire, it was an opportunity. Gary finally broke the silence. "She took your phone while you were asleep." I could almost picture it. She unlocked it. Drove to Mercer Road. Filled out the paperwork using my information. Signed my name, a signature she'd watched me write thousands of times over 18 years. Paid cash. Set everything up. Then drove home before my alarm ever went off. By morning, she was lying beside me again like nothing had happened. I tried to remember that day. Had she looked tired? Had she acted differently? Anything at all? I couldn't remember. Because to me, it had just been another ordinary Tuesday. I left the house early for my 7 o'clock budget meeting like I always did. I kissed my wife goodbye. Grabbed my travel mug. Walked out the front door. And never looked back. 18 years. 18 years of never having a reason to. Hashtag part 6. Gary wasn't finished. He looked up from the paperwork and asked another question. "What about the furnace repair?" I frowned. "What about it?" You said you called the HVAC company that morning. Did you use your cell phone or a landline? I almost laughed. We haven't had a landline in years. I used my cell. He leaned back in his chair. Then pull your outgoing call history. Before I even opened the records, I already knew what I was going to find. Deep down, I'd known ever since Dale texted me from the basement. I just hadn't been willing to admit it. The call to Briggs & Sons Heating and Cooling showed up at exactly 8:47 that morning. The problem was, I wasn't home. I had already been at work for nearly 2 hours. My office parking garage logged every employee's badge when they entered, and my timestamp showed I'd parked a little before 7 that morning. There was no possible way I could have made that phone call. Claire had. She'd used my phone again. Maybe she'd taken it while I slept and returned it before I woke up. Maybe she'd kept it longer than I ever realized. Either way, she was the one who scheduled Dale's visit. She knew exactly what would happen next. A repairman would inspect the furnace. Eventually he'd notice the storage shelves. He'd move them. He'd discover the hidden door. The recording of someone breathing would start playing. He'd panic and text me. I'd rush home. The police would be called. Every piece of the puzzle would fall perfectly into place. She had designed the entire opening act before I even knew there was a game being played. I still don't know how she made the furnace start making that strange metallic noise. Gary thought it was probably something simple. Maybe a small mechanical device attached to the blower motor, just enough to create an unusual sound before being removed later. Whatever she used, it did exactly what she needed it to do. The furnace got my attention. The repairman got into the basement. The hidden room was discovered. The Bluetooth speaker, the burner phone, the fake breathing, even the timing of the recording, it all fit together too perfectly to be an accident. Meanwhile, Claire was hundreds of miles away in Atlanta having dinner with Donna. All she had to do was tap a button on her phone. While I sat upstairs eating a sandwich and watching sports highlights, she was quietly setting the entire plan into motion. Gary stared at the mountain of paperwork spread across my dining room table before speaking again. Louis. His voice had changed. It was lower now. More serious. This wasn't something she threw together in a few months. He pointed toward the bank statements. The money trail alone goes back 7 years. Then he tapped the storage unit paperwork. Your identity was being built into this long before anyone found that basement room. He looked me straight in the eyes. She didn't just learn your habits. He paused. She became fluent in you. Those words stayed with me. Fluent. Not familiar. Not observant. Fluent. She knew how I signed my name. How I organized paperwork. Where I left my phone. When I woke up. When I left for work. What I would notice. More importantly. What I wouldn't. I stood up and walked over to the kitchen window. Outside, the backyard looked exactly the way it always had. The grass I'd mowed hundreds of times. The flower beds Claire planted 2 summers earlier. I remembered watering those plants with her every evening because she insisted the seedlings needed consistency if they were going to survive. I smiled bitterly. I'd spent months helping her grow that garden. All the while, she was patiently digging a grave for me. Standing there, looking out that window, something inside me finally settled. The fear was still there. The hurt was too. But underneath both of them, something else had taken their place. Resolve. I realized I still had one move left. Just one. And I hadn't told Gary what I was thinking. I hadn't told anyone. Because for it to work, Claire had to believe she'd already won. She needed to feel completely safe. Completely confident. She had to think I was exactly where she wanted me, confused, scared, and slowly sinking under the weight of the evidence she'd spent years creating. So I made a decision that Wednesday morning, sitting alone with cold coffee and 7 years' worth of bank records spread across my table. It was a decision I've never regretted. I wasn't going to confront Claire. Not yet. Part 7. Instead of confronting Claire or running straight back to Detective Callahan, I kept everything to myself. There was no point in showing up with theories and half-finished conclusions. Evidence only matters if the person presenting it is believable. At that moment, I wasn't. As far as the Columbus police were concerned, I was the 51-year-old homeowner whose name appeared on a storage unit connected to a missing woman. Whether I claimed I was innocent didn't really change how the facts looked on paper. Claire had planned for that. Of course she had. So I decided to do the one thing she couldn't possibly predict. I became someone she no longer understood. The first call I made wasn't to a lawyer. It was to my older brother, Dennis. Dennis Jackson spent nearly 2 decades in the Army before retiring to Dayton. He's the kind of man who speaks only when he has something worth saying. He owns a few firearms legally, never panics, and somehow manages to stay calm no matter what's happening around him. I drove to see him on Thursday morning. Before I left, I told Claire I needed a couple of days away to clear my head. She looked at me with exactly the expression I'd expect from a caring wife. "Take all the time you need, baby," she said softly. I almost smiled. By then, I knew every emotion she showed me deserved to be questioned. Dennis and I sat at his kitchen table drinking black coffee and eating leftover cornbread while I told him everything from beginning to end. The hidden room. The storage unit. The missing woman. The bank statements. The phone records. The photograph hidden inside Claire's copy of In Cold Blood. He never interrupted me once. For Dennis, that was the equivalent of someone else shouting in disbelief. When I finally finished, he leaned back in his chair and stayed silent for a while. Then he asked one question. "Does Claire have someone she trusts completely?" I nodded. Her friend Renee Gallagher. They've known each other longer than Claire's known me. They talk every week, sometimes more than once. Dennis thought about that. Mostly over the phone? Both. Renee lives in Cincinnati, so she comes to visit a few times each year. But they also have marathon phone conversations that can last 2 or 3 hours. Where does Claire usually take those calls? In the sunroom. I didn't think anything of the question until he asked another one. How long ago did you install the baby monitor in there? I stared at him. I didn't. I know, he replied without changing his expression. But you're about to. I should probably explain something. I'm not a revenge-driven person. For more than a decade I coached youth soccer. I've never started a fight outside a boxing gym. At neighborhood cookouts, I'm usually the guy making sure everybody has something to eat and that the vegetarians aren't forgotten. Getting even has never been part of my personality. But patience? I've always had plenty of that. And patience becomes a powerful weapon when someone else believes they've already won. Dennis handled everything with the kind of precision only a career soldier seems capable of. He bought the baby monitor using cash at a UPS kiosk. Had it shipped to a post office box. Made sure nothing pointed back to either of us. Watching him work made me realize he'd already accepted something I was still trying to process. This wasn't a marriage falling apart. It was an operation. I drove home that Saturday. Claire greeted me at the front door with a hug and asked if I felt any better after getting away. I hugged her back. Counted her heartbeat against my chest. And felt absolutely nothing. That surprised me more than anything else. The anger had faded. The heartbreak was quieter. What remained was something far more useful. Clarity. The following afternoon, while Claire was out grocery shopping, I installed the baby monitor in the sunroom. It was tiny. Wireless. I tucked it behind a decorative plant sitting on the windowsill. That plant had stayed in the exact same spot for 15 years. Neither of us had ever moved it. The whole job took less than 5 minutes. Later that evening, I drove back to Dennis's house. We tested the audio feed on his laptop. It came through perfectly. Then I drove home for dinner as if nothing had happened. Claire made pasta that night. She smiled across the table and asked if I was finally starting to feel like myself again. I smiled back. Yeah, I said. I'm getting there. She reached over and refilled my water glass. Then I waited. Not for a day. Not for a week. I waited 19 days. #### Part 8. For 19 straight days, I played the role Claire expected me to play. I was the same dependable husband I'd always been. The same cooperative homeowner. The same man patiently answering Detective Callahan's questions while the investigation continued. Whenever Roy stopped by, Claire stayed right beside me. She'd hold my hand, speak in a calm voice, and act like a wife who was terrified that her husband had somehow become the target of a terrible mistake. She was unbelievably convincing. There were moments, brief, confusing moments, when I actually questioned my own instincts. I caught myself wondering if grief and fear had pushed me into imagining connections that weren't really there. That's how good she was. Then everything changed. It happened on a Thursday evening during the 3rd week. Renee Gallagher came to spend the evening with Claire. As soon as she arrived, I acted casual. I told Claire I was heading over to Gary's place for a while and probably wouldn't be back until later. She smiled, kissed me on the cheek, and told me to have a good time. I drove away from the house. Only 4 blocks. Then I parked my truck, pulled out my phone, and connected to the audio feed from the baby monitor. The sound was crystal clear. For the first 20 minutes, the conversation was completely ordinary. They talked about Renee's job. A cousin's upcoming wedding. A restaurant in Cincinnati that Claire wanted to try someday. Listening to them, I almost felt ridiculous. I started wondering if I'd let suspicion take over my life. Maybe Gary and I had built an entire theory out of grief, coincidence, and fear. Maybe I really had become paranoid. Then Claire's voice changed. It wasn't dramatic. She didn't suddenly whisper. It was more subtle than that. The warmth disappeared from her tone. Every word became slower, more measured, almost clinical. It was like listening to someone remove a mask without changing their face. He still has no idea, Claire said. There was a brief silence. Then Renee spoke. You're certain? Claire laughed softly. Absolutely. He's making me coffee every morning. Roy still treats him like he's a suspect, and Louis is just. Louis. She almost sounded amused. He's exactly who he's always been. Another short pause. He only sees what's right in front of him. He always has. Renee hesitated before asking another question. What about Angela? Claire answered without the slightest emotion. She's fine. She's in Phoenix. I paid her enough to disappear for 60 days. As long as she keeps quiet until then, everything stays on schedule. I gripped the steering wheel so tightly my fingers started hurting. Renee didn't sound nearly as confident. What happens after that? Claire answered as if she were explaining something obvious. By then it won't matter. The police already have his fingerprints. They have his financial records. They have his name connected to everything. I just have to let the case keep building. She paused. A few more weeks, and it won't need my help anymore. It'll have enough momentum to finish itself. Renee was quiet for several seconds. Finally she asked. And where will you be? Claire chuckled. somewhere warm. Then she laughed. Not nervously. Not out of relief. She laughed the way people laugh when everything has gone exactly the way they hoped. I sat alone inside my truck, for blocks from my own house, listening to my wife casually discuss the future she'd built on top of my destruction. Oddly enough, I didn't feel angry. The same quiet determination I'd found a few weeks earlier settled over me again. Cold. Steady. Certain. I didn't call Dennis. I didn't call Gary. And I definitely didn't call Detective Callahan. Not yet. Because before I made my next move, there was one person I absolutely had to find. Angela Pruitt. #### Part 9. 2 days after Renee came over, I hired a private investigator named Carl Upton. Gary was the one who recommended him. Carl had spent years with the Columbus Police Department before retiring, and he was the kind of man who seemed to run on paperwork and routine. If you looked up "organized" in the dictionary, you'd probably find his picture. I gave him one assignment. Find Angela Pruitt. That was it. No theories. No long explanations. Just find her. It took Carl 6 days. When he called me, the first words out of his mouth were, "I found her." She was exactly where Claire had said she'd be. Phoenix. She'd been staying at a mid-range hotel on Camelback Road, paying cash and using a slightly different name when she checked in. Carl didn't stop with simply locating her. He took photographs. He confirmed her identity. Most importantly, he sat down with her and explained exactly what kind of legal trouble she could be facing if she continued helping Claire. The conversation changed everything. Angela wasn't some criminal mastermind. She wasn't dangerous. She was simply a woman who'd needed money badly enough to make a terrible decision. Once she understood the situation, the fear hit her almost immediately. She admitted everything. She explained how Claire had contacted her. How much she'd been paid. How she'd been instructed to disappear for exactly 60 days and avoid anyone asking questions. Every detail matched what I'd heard through the baby monitor. Carl had a formal statement prepared. Angela signed every page with trembling hands. Afterward, she broke down crying. For nearly 10 minutes, she couldn't stop. Carl stayed with her the entire time. For a man who always looked like he belonged behind a filing cabinet instead of in front of one, he turned out to have more compassion than I expected. By the end of that week, I finally had something solid. Not guesses. Not suspicions. Real evidence. I had the audio recording of Claire admitting exactly what she'd done. I had a signed statement from the supposedly missing woman explaining the entire scheme. And Claire had no idea either of those things existed. That gave me an advantage for the first time since this nightmare had started. Still, I didn't rush to the police. Most people probably would've. I didn't. Walking into the station with all that evidence would have started a legal battle immediately. Claire would have hired attorneys before sunset. She would have stopped talking. Every document would have been challenged. Every recording would have been questioned. The entire case would have dragged on for months, maybe years. By then, I understood something important about Claire. She was incredibly good at tearing things apart. If I gave her time, she'd spend every minute looking for a way to destroy what I'd built against her. I wasn't willing to give her that opportunity. So I chose a different approach. Something simple. Something she would never expect. One Friday evening, Claire was sitting in the sunroom reading In Cold Blood. Seeing that book in her hands almost made me laugh. After everything I'd learned, the irony was impossible to ignore. While she read, I sat quietly at the kitchen table with my laptop. Using an email address she'd never seen before, I sent 2 files to a phone number she wouldn't recognize. The first was the recording of her conversation with Renee. The second was a photograph Carl had taken of Angela alive and well in Phoenix. In the picture, Angela was holding that day's newspaper, so there could be no question about when it had been taken. I didn't include a message. No threats. No explanation. No signature. Just the files. Then I closed the laptop, washed my coffee mug, and went upstairs to bed. About 40 minutes later, I heard footsteps. Keeping my eyes barely open, I watched Claire appear in the bedroom doorway. She stood there holding her phone. Completely motionless. In 15 years of marriage, I'd never seen Claire stand perfectly still. She was always doing something. Straightening a picture frame. Adjusting a blanket. Organizing a drawer. Planning the next thing. But that night, she didn't move at all. She looked like someone who'd just realized the game wasn't unfolding the way she'd expected. For the first time, Claire didn't have all the answers. And that was exactly what I'd been waiting for. Part 10. The next morning, I drove straight to Detective Roy Callahan's office. I didn't call ahead. I didn't ask for a meeting. I simply walked into the station carrying a navy blue folder with a metal clasp. Inside was everything Carl and I had spent weeks putting together. The financial records. The phone logs. The transcript of Claire's conversation with Renee. The audio recording itself. Angela Pruitt's signed statement. The photographs proving she was alive. Every document was organized in chronological order because, whether it comes from years in business or just my personality, I've always believed that facts tell the strongest story when they're impossible to misunderstand. Roy looked surprised to see me. Without saying much, I placed the folder on his desk. "I think you should read this," I said. He opened it and started turning pages. For the next 11 minutes, the room was almost completely silent. The only sound was paper sliding across his desk. Every now and then he'd stop, reread a paragraph, then continue. By the time he reached Angela's statement, his expression had completely changed. Finally, he looked up. "Mr. Jackson." I shook my head. "Roy." He studied me for a moment. Then I said the one sentence I'd been waiting weeks to say. "I think we both know I never rented that storage unit." He didn't answer right away. Instead, he picked up the phone on his desk and dialed a number. I never asked who he called. I didn't need to. Everything started moving after that. Investigators tracked down Angela. They verified Carl's evidence. The recordings were authenticated. The financial trail matched everything I'd already discovered. One by one, the pieces Claire had spent years arranging began turning against her. The investigation that had been closing around me shifted direction. Now it was following her. Claire was arrested the following Tuesday morning. 14 separate charges. Fraud. Conspiracy. Obstruction. Identity-related offenses. The list was long enough that I stopped trying to remember every count. Just after 9 o'clock, 2 patrol cars pulled into my driveway. I stood quietly in the front doorway while detectives entered the house. A few minutes later, they walked Claire outside in handcuffs. The morning was cold enough that every breath turned white in the air. Neighbors peeked through their windows. Curtains moved. Front doors cracked open. Nobody said a word. Claire looked back only once. For 18 years I believed I could read every expression on her face. That morning, I couldn't read anything. There was no confidence. No calculation. No carefully rehearsed smile. Just silence. For the first time since we'd met, I had no idea what she was thinking. I gave her a small nod. Nothing more. She climbed into the patrol car, and the door closed behind her. As I watched the cruiser pull away, one thought kept repeating in my mind. Claire had spent years studying everything about me. She knew how I signed my name. She knew where I left my phone every night. She knew what time I left for work. She knew my routines, my habits, my weaknesses, and every predictable part of my life. But she made one mistake. A mistake so small she never even realized she'd made it. She spent all those years watching what I did. She never bothered to understand how I thought. That's the difference that saved me. I'm not a dramatic man. Never have been. I don't yell. I don't slam doors. I don't enjoy arguments, and I've never cared about getting the last word. But I've always believed something else. The last move matters a whole lot more than the last sentence. Claire spent 15 years carefully building a prison around me. In less than 3 weeks, I quietly built one around her. Even now, I sometimes think about the woman I believed I married. Maybe she never really existed. Or maybe she disappeared long before I noticed. Either way, the truth is simple. She knew my signature better than anyone. She knew my daily routine. She even knew how I'd react under pressure. But there was one thing she never truly understood. My backbone. And in the end, that was the only thing she couldn't plan for.